This is the Aramark Global Harmonized System Safety Training. Global Harmonized Systems, or GHS training, provides detailed information regarding chemical container labeling and data sheets used to find out more about chemicals in your work area. This GHS training will take approximately 15 minutes to complete. Next slide. The purpose of labels is to provide an immediate warning of potential dangers. Labels are not intended to be the only or the most complete source of information on hazards or identity of a hazardous chemical. All container labels must be in English, but information may also be presented in other languages for non-English speaking employees. Labels are required on containers of hazardous chemicals. A container is any bag, barrel, bottle, box, can, compressed gas cylinder, drum, reaction vessel, storage tank, or the like. Next slide. Until chemical manufacturers and distributors revise container labels to show the pictograms and other hazard classification information required by the 2012 revision of the Hazard Communication Standard, you will still see containers with labels that require limited information consisting of the identity of the hazardous chemical, appropriate hazard warnings, and the name and address of the chemical manufacturer, distributor, or other responsible party. Next slide. Knowledge check. Labels are not intended to be the most complete source of information on hazards and identify a hazardous chemical. True or false? The answer is true. Next slide. Newer labels for hazardous chemical containers must include 6 elements. This sample label displays all 6 of the required elements. A product identifier is the name or number used to identify the chemical on the SDS and the list of hazardous chemicals in our hazard communication program. A signal word indicates the severity of the hazard and alerts you to a potential hazard. The 2 signal words are danger and warning. Danger indicates a more severe hazard. A hazard statement is a brief statement that describes the nature of each hazard. A pictogram is a symbol used to show you the chemical's hazard class. There are 8 pictograms for physical and health hazards, and 1 for environmental hazards. A precautionary statement recommends the steps you should take to safely use, handle, and store the chemical. The name, address, and telephone number of the chemical manufacturer, distributor, or other responsible party. Next slide. Knowledge check. Signal words to expect on a label are hazards and warning, danger and watch out, warning and danger, caution and warning. The answer is warning and danger. Next slide. There are 8 pictograms for hazards related to health and physical hazards. Next slide. The flame over a circle is used for oxidizers. Next slide. The flame is used for flammables, self-reactives, pyrophorics, self-heating chemicals, chemicals that emit flammable gas, and organic peroxides. Next slide. The health hazard symbol is used for carcinogenicity, respiratory sensitizers, which are allergic reactions, reproductive toxicity, target organ toxicity, mutagenicity, and aspiration toxicity, which is directly inhaling a harmful solid or liquid chemical or indirectly inhaling liquid after vomiting. Next slide. The exclamation mark is used for irritants, skin and eye, skin sensitizers for allergic reaction, acute toxicity, narcotic effects such as dizziness, drowsiness, headache, and nausea, and respiratory tract irritants. Next slide. Relabeling. Employees can rely on the labels affixed to the containers when they arrive in the workplace. Unless a label falls off a container or becomes unreadable, OSHA does not require containers to be relabeled. Container transference. When hazardous chemicals are transferred into another container, the new container must be properly labeled. Alternatives. Signs, placards, batch tickets, or printed operating procedures can be used in place of labels on individual stationary containers, such as tanks. Next slide. Knowledge check. Signs, placards, batch tickets, or printed operating procedures can be used in place of labels on individual stationary containers. True or false? True. Next slide. Although they will be phased out over several years, there are two other commonly used hazard labeling systems you may encounter. The first is the NFPA diamond, which consists of 4 numbers or letters arranged in a diamond shape. The blue, red, and yellow fields provide information on health, flammability, and reactivity using a numbering scale ranging from 0 to 4. A value of 0 means that the material poses essentially no hazard. A rating of 4 indicates extreme danger. The white segment of the diamond indicates a special hazard, and a variety of symbols are used for hazards such as water, reactive, oxidizing agent, explosive, radioactive, and poison. Next slide. A second labeling system is called HMIS. The color and number coding are identical to the NFPA diamond, but instead of the diamond, the HMIS uses a color bar system. Next slide. The key difference between the two is the white section, which is used to indicate the level of protective equipment required instead of a special hazard. The level of protection is indicated by a letter. For example, the letter A indicates safety glasses are required, and the letter B specifies the use of safety glasses and gloves. Next slide. Knowledge check. The hazardous chemical labeling system you will see is the NFPA diamond, HMIS, the new hazard communication labeling system, or all of the above. The answer is all of the above. Next slide. The purpose of the Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS, is to provide detailed information to employees, including potential hazardous effects, physical and chemical characteristics, and recommendation for appropriate protective measures. MSDSs are readily available where the hazardous substance is used to each employee in that area without permission of management. The MSDSs are being replaced by an updated version known as the Safety Data Sheets, or SDSs. Until chemical manufacturers and distributors fully convert MSDSs to the Safety Data Sheets format, you will continue to see MSDSs. Next slide. There are many reasons to check an MSDS or SDS. For example, you may want to verify label information, determine if you are using the recommended PPE, learn about the potential health effects related to exposure to the chemical, and review recommended first aid and emergency procedures. Next slide. White labels provide basic information about hazards. Detailed information is available on the chemicals SDS. There must be an SDS available for each hazardous chemical in the workplace. Chemical suppliers provide the SDSs, but the employer is responsible for making sure the SDSs being used are kept up to date. The SDSs must be in English, but Aramark may have copies in other languages as well. The SDSs must be immediately available to you in your work area. Let your supervisor know right away if you can't find an SDS or you think one is missing. Next slide. Knowledge check. MDSs are being replaced by an updated version known as Material Data Sheets, Safety Data Sheets, Safe Material Sheets, or none of the above. The answer is Safety Data Sheets. Next slide. SDSs must contain the following sections in order to be listed. Next slide. Section 1, Identification, includes the product identifier, manufacturer or distributor name, addresses, and phone number, emergency phone number, recommended use, and restrictions on use. Next slide. Section 2, Hazard Identification, includes the hazard classification and the required label elements. Next slide. Section 3, Composition, Information on Ingredients, includes the chemical name, common name, and synonyms, chemical abstract services or CAS number, and percentages of ingredients in mixtures. Next slide. Section 4, First Aid Measures, includes necessary measures for each route of exposure, important acute or delayed symptoms, and any immediate or special treatment requirements. Next slide. Section 5, Firefighting Measures, lists suitable extinguishing methods, hazardous combustion products, equipment, and special precautions for firefighters. Next slide. Section 6, Accidental Release Measures, lists protective equipment, emergency procedures, and proper methods and materials for containment and cleanup. Next slide. Section 7, Handling and Storage, lists precautions for safe handling and storage, including any incompatibilities. Next slide. Section 8, Exposure Controls, Personal Protection, lists OSHA's permissible exposure limits, or PELs, threshold limit values, or TLVs, other recommended exposure limits, appropriate engineering controls, and personal protective equipment. Next slide. Section 9, Physical and Chemical Properties, lists the chemical's appearance, its odor and odor threshold, and physical properties such as pH, flash point, upper and lower flammability or explosive limits, vapor pressure and density, auto-ignition temperature, decomposition temperature, viscosity, and relative density. Next slide. Section 10, Stability and Reactivity, lists chemical stability, the potential of hazardous reactions, conditions to avoid, incompatible materials, and hazardous decomposition products. Next slide. Section 11, Toxicological Information, includes routes of exposure, symptoms, immediate and chronic effects, available toxicity data, and whether the chemical is considered a carcinogen. Next slide. OSHA does not enforce sections 12 through 15, so an SDS may not include information on these sections. Next slide. Section 12, Ecological Information, would include aquatic and terrestrial ecotoxicity, bioaccumulative potential, and ecological persistence and degradability. Section 13, Disposal Considerations, would include a description of waste residues and information on safe handling and disposal. Next slide. Section 14, Transport Information, would include the proper DOT shipping name, UN number, hazard class, and packing group. Next slide. Section 15, Regulatory Information, would include any product-specific safety, health, and environmental regulations. Next slide. Finally, Section 16, Other Information, includes the date of preparation of the last revision of the SDS. Next slide. Knowledge check. There must be an SDS or MSDS available for each hazardous chemical in the workplace. True or false? The answer is true. Next slide. We're almost done. Let's do a quick summary of what we covered. The purpose of chemical labels, reading and understanding chemical labels, including the new GHS chemical label format, the purpose of the safety data sheets, and using data sheets to obtain detailed information about chemicals, using PPE, and knowing what to do in a chemical emergency. Next slide. The Aramark Hazard Communication Program was developed to help provide and maintain a healthful work environment. If you are unsure about what chemicals and hazards are in your work area, or are not sure if you need PPE for your job, or would like more information about the chemicals you work with, please ask a supervisor. You now have the knowledge to identify the hazards of chemicals and how to protect yourself. Next slide. This is the conclusion of the Aramark Global Harmonized System Training. Thank you.